Everybody. It's Will Chabun from the Regina chapter of the Canadian Aviation Historical Society. And today's presentation is about a visit that I made in January of 2019 to the retired American aircraft carrier USS Midway, which is now tied up in San Diego Harbor and has been converted into a floating aircraft museum. I was reading TripAdvisor today, and I found out that the Midway Museum has become, in only about 15 years, the most popular tourist attraction in all of San Diego County, and it's competing there against the beaches and the San Diego Zoo, which is rated as the best in the world. The Midway is really quite something to see. The morning that we were there, there must have been about 2,000 people aboard, and there was no special events, just had an incredible draw, no question about that. Now, this, of course, is the Canadian Aviation Historical Society, so I've managed to find a couple of Canadian sidebars in this story, so listen for them, and I think you'll find them quite interesting. As I mentioned, the Midway is moored in downtown San Diego. It's very easy to find. San Diego is a terrific place. You don't need a vehicle. Public transit is excellent. We stayed about 2 miles north of downtown San Diego in a suburb called Old Town, and we were able to take the San Diego trolley, which is actually an LRT system in the same way that Calgary and Edmonton have them, from about 2 blocks from our motel right to within about 3 blocks of the Midway. It was simple, fast, reliable transportation. And what you're seeing on the screen now is the first thing you see when you arrive at the Midway. Admission, as I recall, was about $20 Canadian. The wait was maybe 2 minutes. It was very easy to get in there, a very welcoming bunch. I've been reading up on it, and I see that the foundation that operates the Midway Museum has about 800 volunteers, half of them full-time tour givers. San Diego, of course, is a big Navy town, and there's lots of gentlemen and ladies running around that ship who can talk about the naval experience, for lack of a better phrase, from having first-hand knowledge of it. It's quite special. As you can see from this photo, the Midway is moored right smack downtown. If you're ever going there, I might point out that the hotels in downtown San Diego were, and probably will be in the future, pretty high end. But if you look around enough and exploit the San Diego trolley, you can find some reasonable accommodation at a very good price. No question about that. Now, not all of the Midway is open for public tours. The flight deck, as you can see from this schematic diagram, and a good deal of the hangar deck, which is the level right underneath it, and a small proportion of the deck below the hangar deck are all open for tours. There is a provision for electronic tours using a recording device and stations. I'm old school, so I prefer to listen to real human beings talk to me. The Midway, of course, is named for the 1942 battle at Midway. If I may be permitted a personal note, I remember my parents talking at the supper table about how the most frightening part of the Second World War for them, living in southern Saskatchewan at the time, was the period between Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and Midway in early June 1942. Midway was a great victory for the United States Navy, and it ended that 6-month period when the Japanese fleet seemed to go wherever it wanted at will. Malaya fell, Hong Kong, Philippines, what is now Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies. Burma fell. Several cities in Australia were bombed in the first half of 1942. There was to be a Japanese landing in North America, that is to say, on the Aleutian Islands, during that same period. It was a scary time. And although we know now that the possibility of a Japanese landing on the mainland of North America, or even Australia or Hawaii, was remote because of Japan's lack of shipping, of transportation, people didn't know this at that time. And thus there was a great deal of fear about what was going to happen in the face of what seemed like an invincible Japanese fleet. Long story short, the Battle of Midway involved a Japanese attempt to wipe out the American surface fleet in the Pacific once and for all. The plan was to strike at Midway Island, which was an American possession, about 4 sailing days west of Hawaii. The assumption that the Japanese leadership made was that the American fleet would be taken by surprise, would sail out obediently and slowly toward Midway. It would be decimated, it would be harried by Japanese submarines and eventually decimated in a face-to-face confrontation with the main Japanese battle fleet. What the Japanese didn't realize was that American naval intelligence had been able to break some of the Japanese codes, not all of them, but some of them. And as a result, when the Japanese arrived in the vicinity of Midway Island, 3 American aircraft carriers were already there. And when the Japanese were launching their initial bombing raids on Midway Island, American aircraft were in the air within mere hours. The result was the loss of 1 American carrier, but 4 Japanese carriers. It was a stunning blow to Japan. I've been reading a book on this battle, and it was such a surprise to the Japanese naval leadership that all of the sailors who survived this battle were brought home, ordered to shut up, and then very quickly posted out to other places so that they could not transmit the news of this naval defeat to the Japanese civilian population. If I can act as a theater critic for a second, the recent Hollywood feature that came out on the Battle of Midway was actually quite well done in terms of accuracy and discussing the intelligence issues and the grim determination of the pre-war American Navy to rise to the challenge. It's quite a nice piece of work. Anyway, the shadow, or the memory of the Battle of Midway is very much in evidence on the hangar deck of the Midway, which is where you enter the ship. Here is a full-scale model, and I must confess I don't know if it's a replica or some kind of a scratch-built 1-to-1 scale model of a Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, which was the type that won the Battle of Midway for the United States Navy. Quite close to it is this, and I'm thinking that looks too good to be a restored aircraft. I'm thinking it's a fiberglass model of a Grumman Wildcat, that stocky little fighter that was outperformed by the by the Japanese Zero, but rarely outfought by the Zero, thanks to some innovative fighter tactics. Here's an overall view of the hangar deck of the Midway, which will give you an idea of just how large it is. This is looking east. You can see a number of aircraft along there. There is a food court. There is a very nice souvenir shop. There are things for kids to do, like this simulators, which must have been scavenged from the United States Navy and put to use entertaining kids. And this outdoor area where you can sit, have a coffee, look across the harbor at the modern ships of the U.S. Navy. There are a number of other veteran and vintage aircraft on display in the hangar deck, like this Vought Corsair, big, burly beast with a huge engine, a Grumman TBF Avenger, a lot of airplane to be supported by only one engine, but it served well and it fought well, and indeed it served Canada as an anti-submarine aircraft well into the 1950s. There is this, well, we call it a Harvard. The American Navy call it an SNJ. It's the same aircraft out of the North American Aviation Factory in Inglewood, California. And then you descend into the depths of the ship. The deck below the hangar deck. Here is the ship's chapel, very small, considering that late in its career, the Midway had around 4,000 personnel aboard it. Big ship by anybody's standards. Indeed, when it came off of when it was commissioned into the United States Navy in 1945, it was briefly the biggest ship in the world. It and its two sisters, the Coral Sea and the Franklin D. Roosevelt. I believe that the three of them were the first ships, major warships at least, that were too big to go through the Panama Canal. That's how big they are. Here's what the average sailor would see, one of several cafeterias aboard the Midway. It sort of looks like the high school cafeteria at Miller. Not fancy, but it's not a harsh cafeteria style either. Officers ate with in a somewhat more refined quarters. No waiters, but there were at least tables where they could chat, and they had to pick up their meals from this steam galley. This shows the captain's quarters. It would be pretty posh if you're a 19-year-old sailor, and that was the average age of the personnel on the ship. But for somebody who has a responsibility of commanding a ship that large, it's surprisingly stark and modest. Also on the deck below the hangar deck, main engine control, and a display that talks about the immense heat that built up in the Midway. It was absolutely fearsome. You'll see from this, 120 degrees Fahrenheit for days on end. And there are stories I've seen that some sailors went aboard the Midway, went to their duty stations below decks. They, of course, bunked in the bowels of the ship, and they would go for weeks, literally weeks, without seeing the light of day. One of the display panels on the Midway says that after you endure 120-degree heat for days on end, the 95 or even 100-degree temperatures in the Mediterranean, when you get to go ashore, are like a a cool, pleasant day. And here's one of our tour group in one of the, I believe there were 4 engine rooms aboard the Midway, and it gives you an idea of just how complicated the steam technology was. Machine shop that, according to the signs, boasted it could build just about anything that was needed to keep the Midway sailing. And this shot of the passageway out of the engine room area. Here's something called a steam throttle training station, and when we reactivate Tim's audio capability, perhaps he can tell us exactly what that means. Here's a chart that gives you an idea of the huge number of personnel and the different skill sets that were required to operate the Midway, not only in the aviation, the carrier air group, but the engineering hands and the supply personnel, medical and dental operations group. Truly a substantial community at sea, capable of traveling wherever it was needed. And the Midway certainly was needed all over the world in its lifespan. It was, as I mentioned, commissioned in 1945, about 2 weeks after the Japanese surrender was completed. And if you're familiar with American political history, you'll know that there was a furious controversy in the late 1940s between those generals, particularly in the US Air Force, who thought that the peace could be kept by nuclear weapons, nothing else, and by those personnel, and the Marine Corps and the Navy were in the fore, who knew that there would have to be a much more flexible response to things. At one point, the clever people in the Pentagon wanted to cut the US Navy down to 1 or 2 aircraft carriers. It had in the vicinity of 100 at the end of the Pacific War in 1945. The Navy fought back with a great deal of skill and was able to save itself and to save its carrier fleet. And it certainly came in handy in fighting the war in Korea in the early 1950s and in a number of other things. The Midway was launched and immediately went to, among other places, the Mediterranean. It never had a chance to serve in Task Force 77 off Korea, but it made 3 tours in Vietnam on what was called Yankee Station off the coast of North Vietnam, and aircraft operating from the Midway shot down the first and the last North Vietnamese aircraft to be downed by American fighters during the war. Getting back to our tour of the ship, here's the little post office that was aboard the ship, mail being delivered by COD planes, carrier onboard delivery aircraft. Here's a look at the typical Liferaft supplies that would be used in the event that the ship was badly damaged and sinking. And here's a sort of a statistical story, a recap of that. Laid down in 1943, commissioned in 1945. 10 years later, it began a major refit, getting an angled flight deck, which permitted aircraft to be parked on the foredeck, while other aircraft landed and took off from the angled deck midships. In 1966, there was another major refit, bigger elevators for carrying aircraft up and down, a better catapult for safety, and an air conditioning plant to address those fearsome temperatures in it. In 1973, it made some interesting history by being home ported in Japan, the first American warship to have as its home port a city in another country. And that meant that a large number of Navy families moved over to Yokosuka, Japan, and to put down roots there. The Midway was decommissioned in 1992 after serving in the first Gulf War. That means it had a remarkably long active naval career, somewhere in the vicinity of, we see, just under 50 years, 47 years. And I don't think that there's any other, from what I've read, there's no other American warship that has had as long an active career in combat and in serving its country. A truly remarkable record. And the choice of the Midway for a permanent memorial is certainly well deserved. Going back into its early history, I see that right after it was launched in 1945, it did some shakedown maneuvers, and then, and here's the Canadian connection, it sailed to a point off the coast of Labrador in February 1946, just to see what was involved in operating aircraft day after day in such a bitterly cold climate. The American Navy, of course, had spent most of the war in hot temperatures in the Pacific. Could it operate successfully in bitter cold? The smaller article there reminds us that the Midway was the launch vehicle for a German-designed V2 rocket that had been captured by the Allies. Never before had anybody brought together these two technologies, the aircraft carrier and the ballistic missile, the shape of things to come. Now, what you're seeing is the deck, the flight deck of the Midway, and some of those thousands of people who were on it that day. I gave a lot of thought to how to list the aircraft and helicopters that were on the flight deck of the Midway. And it occurred to me that the only thing that made sense was to do them with a tip of the hat to the scale model builders in our audience by their markings. For example, this Sikorsky HO3S helicopter, I think in Canada we know it as an H5, was in the dark blue that was the standard issue for the American Navy from about the end of the Second World War until 1955. By the way, if you are a fan of the one of the greatest war movies ever made, the very poignant movie Bridges at Toko-Ri with William Holden and Grace Kelly and Frederick March, you'll recognize this type of a helicopter from its starring role in that film. Now nearby is this Grumman Panther jet fighter, and I promised you a couple of Canadian sidebars, and this is the second one, following up on my Labrador reference. This aircraft is from Navy Squadron VF-781. It's there on the aft fuselage. It is in the colors of a pilot named Royce Williams. One day in the autumn of 1952, Williams and three other pilots were guarding the carrier Oriskany off the coast of North Korea, quite far north. And the alarm came that there were a number of Russian jet fighters, not Chinese, not North Korean, but Russian jet fighters coming out to mix it up with them. The leader of the flight had a mechanical problem. He dropped out. His wingman went with him. Williams and his wingman stayed to ward off the Russians. It wasn't known what type of aircraft they were. They turned out to be MiG-15 jet fighters. which were a full 70 miles an hour faster than the Panther. Williams' wingman was unable to fire for some reason, so Royce Williams had to take on 6 or 7 faster fighters all by himself. When he returned to the ship, his crew counted 263 holes in his aircraft. Now, there just happened to be an American Navy cruiser with a team from the National Security Agency in the area. In fact, between the task force in Vladivostok, and the NSA detail aboard the ship included a number of Russian linguists. Williams claimed 2, maybe 3 aircraft destroyed and another damaged, but those were mere claims. Williams wrote his report and went on with his life. A couple of years later, an admiral found him at a reception and said, "Lieutenant Williams, please don't tell anybody about your dogfight." And it emerged only within the last decade that Williams single-handedly shot down 4 Russian aircraft. All this was confirmed by the National Security Agency linguists monitoring radio communications at the scene. As I mentioned, VF 781 was the squadron in which Royce Williams served. At the same time, serving in it was the only Canadian officer who served on exchange with the U.S. Navy in the Korean War. It was Lieutenant Joe MacBrien. And he was posted about a year earlier to VF 781, Fighter Squadron 781 at Miramar near San Diego. He took over a flight, a strike against North Korean targets in the spring of 1953 after the leader's aircraft went unserviceable. He kept everybody together, found the target successfully, led them in, and completed a successful mission. And for that, he received an American Distinguished Flying Cross. Imagine my surprise only a few years ago when I learned that Joe MacBrien's daughter was married to a friend of mine here in Regina. I tried to look up Joe MacBrien. He's still alive, last time I checked. He is in the Sunnyside Hospital Veterans Wing in Toronto. Apparently he has Alzheimer's quite severely, so he can't remember much, if any, of his time on that exchange posting. But fortunately, he left a mini biography with us. I've got a copy of it. It's only about 20 pages long. If anybody wants to see it, it's really quite fascinating. How he was not expected by our American friends when he arrived in San Diego in the spring of 1952, how he had to rely on a friendly British exchange officer to help him find his way, how he was quickly put to work because he was one of the few veteran pilots assigned to this squadron. He tells about how the Americans, quite generously, offered to disguise him as an American, lest he be shot down and captured and turned into a propaganda tool. Really quite a fascinating story, all right. And he's almost forgotten in Canada. I put in a picture of a scale model of Joe MacBrien's fighter, aircraft 109 from VF 781, in case anybody wants to try building it. It would be a fine tribute to a distinguished but almost forgotten Canadian aviator. Okay, moving along on the flight deck. Here we have one of the first naval helicopters, a Piasecki HUP. American aviation, or the U.S. Navy aviation authorities, had a peculiar way of designating aircraft. Basically, the way it worked was that the first letter in their name indicated what it did or what it was: a helicopter, a fighter, a torpedo bomber, a scout, yada, yada, yada. The second one indicated it was what it did. U is for utility. And the third letter, P, indicates the manufacturer, Piasecki. Looking down those to see, D stood for Douglas Aircraft. F stood for the famous Grumman Aircraft Corporation of Long Island, and on and on. It was a peculiar system that Uncle Sam finally rationalized in the early 1960s, so that everybody was using the same names and abbreviations. The big nose on this Grumman Cougar can be explained by the fact that it's a reconnaissance aircraft. Incidentally, it also shows the color scheme, light gray over white, that was adopted by the United States Navy in the late 1950s. If it looks similar to that Grumman Panther that Joe MacBrien flew, that's because it was based on the same airframe, only with swept wings and swept tail section. Otherwise, the Panther and Cougar were identical. Now, in Canada, one of the most famous aircraft you can think of is the Sabre, designed in the United States but built here under license. Many people have forgotten that the U.S. Navy also operated a version of the Sabre, which was called the FJ Fury, the J standing for North American Aviation, the manufacturer. The distinctive sit of this aircraft reminds us that they had to make some modifications for successful carrier operations, like a much extended nose gear. But even with a relatively small wing, it worked and was a reasonably successful aircraft operating from American aircraft carriers in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Sikorsky HUS, and there's a, wish I could get rid of this. There we go. HUS-1 Seahorse, the U standing for utility. And if you are of a certain vintage like me, you will remember helicopters of this type plucking Mercury and Gemini astronauts out of the Atlantic and Pacific after their capsules had successfully landed. It is said that Gus Grissom's capsule took on water and was so heavy that there was grave danger that that would bring down the Seahorse that picked up his capsule in about, 1962 or 1963. The crew let it go and the capsule sank. This looks like a Grumman tracker, doesn't it? It's actually a Grumman trader, which was the cargo and passenger version of the famous tracker. It was used to carry personnel, visiting politicians, etc., to and from aircraft carriers. It could also carry supplies and important parts, for example, that had to be transported. And in a salute to that, you'll see the name on the aft pylon, Easy Way Airlines. It sounds like a good name for an aviation company. This is the best photograph I could get of the Vought F-8 Crusader aircraft, which is parked on the deck of the Midway. As you can see by all that green primer paint, it's undergoing restoration. The Crusader had a pretty long career in the U.S. Navy, about 15 or 16 years. It was much beloved by pilots because the angle of incidence of the wing, as you could see, could be adjusted to make landing and visibility better as the aircraft was approaching one of those relatively small aircraft carriers. As well, the Crusader was a gunfighter. In an age when the pointy-headed guys in Washington said that you could fight future wars with missiles, the Crusader had 420-millimeter cannon built into it. And that was, I have read, a very reassuring safety factor for aviators who had to go up against North Vietnamese aircraft during the Vietnam War. The Crusader's stablemate in the early 1960s was this magnificently sleek-looking A5 Vigilante, designed by North American Aviation in Los Angeles as a high-speed Mach 2 bomber, but actually used as a high-speed reconnaissance aircraft. It was unarmed, but it was so fast, it could do Mach 2 quite easily, that the North Vietnamese had a great deal of trouble catching them, much less shooting them down. And any aviation buff knows this. The McDonnell Phantom, specifically an F4 version in the colors of one of the squadrons that was assigned to the Midway in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, this particular aircraft has an interesting story in there, in that it has a silhouette of two North Vietnamese aircraft, symbolizing that it was the victor in dogfights with the North Vietnamese aircraft in 1965. In fact, on the very same date, June 17th, 1965. And there's a plaque noting that. If you remember John McCain, the late John McCain, senator from Arizona, you'll know that his claim to fame, among many other things, was that he flew the A4 Skyhawk off of the carrier Forrestal. Here's an A4, tiny little aircraft, all things considered, so small that the wings did not have to be folded when it was in storage on an aircraft carrier. Yet it was surprisingly good at carrying large bomb loads. It was nimble, it was sturdy. I believe it's still in use in places like Argentina and perhaps Israel. Really an amazing aircraft, because that means it's had an operational life of somewhere in the vicinity of 55 years. The A1 Skyraider, which was designed in the closing days of the Second World War, used throughout Korea and Vietnam because it worked. It had a radial engine so that it could, and a huge fuel tank so that it could fly forever. And it was particularly valuable in providing close support to search and rescue helicopters looking for downed airmen. It even came off the victor in a couple of gun battles with Chinese or North Vietnamese MiGs in the course of the Vietnamese War. The A3, designed by Douglas, produced in another version for the American Navy, an awfully big aircraft for an aircraft carrier, and that's probably why it did not have a very long career in the United States Navy, despite having the flexibility of being a strike aircraft and electronics aircraft or a refueling tanker. It could do it all. There's its crest. VAQ 130 means it's an electronic warfare squadron, a naval helicopter that was used to support gunboats operating in Vietnam during the conflict there. The appropriately bellicose crest on the nose of the aircraft. And this, you'll recognize it if you're a Canadian, because we call it the Labrador or the Voyageur. The US Navy and Marine Corps called it the CH-46 Sea Knight, and it was used for medium transport off aircraft carriers from air bases into the jungle, most everywhere. Like its Canadian counterparts, it had a really long life, entering service in the early 1960s, going through various modifications, and then remaining in service until well into the 1990s before it was replaced. There's another shot of the same machine. The Cayman Sea Sprite, and I draw your attention to the dark gray markings that the U.S. Navy has worn since about the early 1980s. A tiny, cramped little helicopter that specialized in anti-submarine warfare, but had one that had a remarkably long life from somewhere in the 1960s until only a few years ago, because it was just so reliable and so versatile. The Grumman EA-6B Growler. They took a standard Grumman Intruder, stretched it, put in a second pair of cockpit of seats and ejection seats for electronics operators, and then based them on carriers to provide the kind of electronic warfare magic that's needed in a modern conflict. The T-2 Buckeye, which was the standard American Navy trainer, jet trainer, that is, from the 1960s until only about 10 years ago when it was replaced by the Hawk, designed by British Aerospace and flying in a Canadian version around Regina these days. Canadians will also recognize the Sikorsky SH-3 Sea King, which the American Navy has been using almost as long as we have, although I think they have newer ones than we do. A hull shaped like a boat, plenty of room inside, a tough, durable old beast that first arrived on ships' decks back in the early 1960s and has been operating off of them ever since. Somewhat newer is this S3 Viking. It's the jet age equivalent of a Grumman tracker, a tiny, cramped, squashed little sub-chasing aircraft with folding wings and about 4 hours endurance, small enough to fit into an aircraft carrier, big enough to carry the electronics and weapons needed to run down Russian submarines. Now, what kind of airplane would have a big dome on top of it like this? Well, it's a Grumman E-2 Hawkeye, airborne early warning aircraft. Flies off carriers, and then its radar, located in that dome above the fuselage, goes to work and looks for bad guys coming toward the carrier task group. It is, I am told, that the dome, although large, is aerodynamically shaped to provide at least some lift to help the Hawkeye on its mission. The Grumman A6 Intruder, and most modern of all, here's an F-18 Hornet in the peculiar desert camouflage that the Navy's aggressor squadrons or Top Gun squadrons used. Everybody here has seen Top Gun, haven't they? Sure. Dumb question. We're nearing the end of the presentation, and I wanted to show you this. One of the final illustrations I wanted to show you is this photo that I took of cardboard cutouts of flight deck crew lined up against the island, the structure on the flight deck from which the ship is commanded. The striking thing about them, of course, is the bright colors. And why is that? Well, it's all about safety and being able to quickly identify what various personnel are doing. Here's the code of what's happening. Yellow indicates an aircraft handling, catapult, or arresting gear officer. Green is for catapult and arresting gear crew. Red, ordnance handler, crash and salvage crew, explosive ordnance disposal, and firefighter damage control. Purple, fuel handler. Blue is for trainees at a number of levels. Brown is for an air wing plane captain and leading petty officer. And white is for inspectors and quality assurance personnel. As I mentioned, San Diego is one of the major naval bases of the United States Navy. And if you get a coffee and sit on the little coffee shop on the hangar deck facing south, you'll see all sorts of warships coming and going through the harbor. Overhead, there are a steady stream of naval helicopters coming and going. It's really quite the place. This map gives you an idea of where the Midway Museum is located in San Diego, right smack downtown, adjacent to the tourist-oriented Gaslight Quarter and what is that other place? Seafront Village. It's quite the place, no question about that. Now, getting to it is best done in view of the shortage of parking in downtown San Diego by taking public transit to the Santa Fe Depot, which is in the upper right-hand corner of this, and then walking 4 pretty short blocks to the Midway Museum. When we were there, the charge to go to the museum was somewhere in the ballpark of $15 or $20, depending on your age and whether or not you were a veteran. Money well spent. I've mentioned public transit, and here is a map showing the 3 San Diego trolley lines. So it's a LRT system, much like that in Edmonton or Calgary. All 3 of them, fortunately, converge on the Santa Fe Depot, from which it is just a short walk to the Midway Museum. Now, the Midway is not the only aviation museum in the San Diego area. If you go into Balboa Park, which is the huge 1,500-acre public park just to the east of downtown San Diego, you'll see this, the San Diego Air and Space Museum. It is one of about 25 museums within the park. There's a photographic arts museum, a science center, an art institute, a local history museum, a railroad museum, an automotive museum, 16 scenic gardens, plus the world-famous San Diego Zoo. It really is quite the place. I draw your attention to the aircraft on the left-hand side of this photograph. It's made in San Diego. It's a Convair F-2Y jet fighter designed in the late 1940s or early 1950s and designed to land and take off from the lagoons of South Pacific Islands. Note that it was to have landed on skis, not pontoons or floats, but skis. On the right of the door is the familiar silhouette of the SR-71 Blackbird spy plane. Quite the museum. It's very heavy on the history of the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps, plus Convair, which was based in San Diego for many, many years, and the local airline, the late lamented Pacific Southwest Airlines. Now, there's one more major aviation museum in the San Diego area. It is the Flying Leatherneck Aviation Museum, which is in the northern part of the metro area. You can get close to it on the San Diego trolley, but then you have to take Uber or a taxi cab the rest of the way. It is located just outside Naval or Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, which is where, of course, Top Gun was filmed. I didn't make it to this place, but it sure looks interesting. And I've got to say that any city that has 3 good aviation museums, the USS Midway Museum, the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and the Flying Leatherneck Aviation Museum, clearly has much to commend it. Well, that's all. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. If you have any questions, go to the website of the CAHS Regina chapter and send me a note. Thanks so much, and I hope to see you in San Diego.